On the morning of 17 April 2026, at the Remington Apartments complex in northeast Wichita, Kansas, a 25-year-old woman stepped out of her flat, preparing to leave for work as she had on so many ordinary mornings before. Her name was Ivy Unruh, a former United States Marine who was working as an engineer for PBS Kansas. Only a few months earlier, she had moved out of the home she once shared with her husband, filed for divorce, and begun building a new life, determined to leave behind the man she had once believed she would spend her future with. A doorbell camera captured her leaving the flat. Just 37 seconds later, a gunshot rang out. The man waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs was not a stranger. It was her estranged husband, the very man Ivy had described in her divorce filings as physically and verbally abusive throughout their marriage. He had come to return some of her personal belongings. Among them was a Nintendo Switch. Only minutes later, that same man called 911, his voice shaking as he repeatedly told the dispatcher, "I shot her. I shot her." How did what should have been a routine exchange of personal belongings between two people ending a marriage become the final moments of Ivy Unruh's life? And why did a small handheld game console become one of the central details in this heartbreaking case? This is the story behind one of the homicide investigations that shocked Kansas in 2026. A story that began with a marriage built on love and ended on a cold apartment staircase. Ivy Unruh grew up with a strong sense of discipline and responsibility, qualities that led her to serve in the United States Marine Corps. After completing her military service, she transitioned into broadcast engineering, joining PBS Kansas as an engineer, a role that demanded precision, technical expertise, and a high level of responsibility, all qualities her colleagues would later remember with deep admiration. PBS Kansas President Victor Hogstrom described Unruh as a dependable, intelligent employee who worked well with everyone around her. To her friends, she was known as a strong and courageous woman not only because of her military background, but also because of the way she faced the personal challenges in her own life. Her husband, Joshua Orlando, 29, also had connections to the military and academic communities. The two met through classes they were both attending. Like many couples, their marriage began with hopes of building a future together. Over time, however, the relationship began to fracture, and those cracks eventually grew impossible to ignore. In August 2025, Unruh formally filed for divorce. In court documents, she stated that she had endured both physical and emotional abuse throughout their marriage to Orlando. These were not allegations made in the heat of the moment, but claims set out in official legal filings submitted to the court. After moving into a new apartment, Unruh told the property manager that she wanted to distance herself from her allegedly abusive estranged husband and specifically asked about the building's security features. She also requested that her contact information not be shared with her former landlord, fearing that the landlord had a close relationship with Orlando. For his part, Orlando claimed the marriage had broken down for a number of reasons, including allegations that Unruh had been unfaithful. During the divorce proceedings, the couple agreed on how to divide their belongings. Orlando kept his personal firearm, while Unruh retained the Nintendo Switch they had once shared. By mid-April 2026, after a series of increasingly tense exchanges, both had accepted that there was no path to reconciliation. Orlando agreed to return the remainder of Unruh's belongings, but instead of leaving them outside her door as planned, he chose to stay and wait for her to come outside. In the days leading up to that fateful morning, Orlando reached out to Unruh, suggesting that they study together for a class they were both taking. What appeared to be an innocent request quickly turned into yet another argument, widening the distance between them even further. Eventually, the two reached what seemed to be a final decision. Their relationship was beyond saving. They agreed that Orlando would leave the rest of Unruh's belongings outside the door of her new flat, allowing the exchange to take place without either of them having to see the other in person. On the morning of 17 April 2026, Orlando arrived at the Remington Apartments complex early. But instead of following their agreement, he chose to stay, waiting at the bottom of the staircase leading to Unruh's flat. In his hands was a bag containing her Nintendo Switch and several other personal belongings. It was a small change to the original plan, but one that would prove critically important to everything that followed. By choosing to wait rather than simply leaving the items outside her door and walking away as promised, Orlando ensured that the face-to-face encounter Unruh had repeatedly tried to avoid became unavoidable. According to footage captured by the apartment's doorbell camera, Unruh left her flat at her usual time, preparing for another workday at PBS Kansas. She carried a black backpack over her right shoulder and a handbag on her left arm, the picture of an ordinary morning, with nothing to suggest what would unfold less than a minute later. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Unruh saw Orlando waiting for her. According to Orlando's later statement to investigators, her immediate reaction was one of obvious anger, a response far removed from what would normally be expected during a routine exchange of personal belongings. Orlando told investigators that he asked Unruh why she no longer wanted to meet him face to face. According to his own account, that question quickly sparked another argument between them, right there at the foot of the apartment staircase, only seconds before everything spiraled beyond anyone's control. Just 37 seconds after Unruh stepped through the door of her flat, as confirmed by the doorbell camera footage, that brief exchange reached a turning point that neither of them, perhaps, had truly anticipated. According to the investigation records released later, the argument between the two quickly escalated. In a moment of anger, Unruh swung the bag she was holding containing the Nintendo Switch towards Orlando, striking the left side of his face. In his statement to investigators, Orlando said the impact immediately triggered a memory from January 2025, when he alleged that Unruh had attacked him with a replica Zelda sword after he had thrown a slipper at her during an earlier argument. It was at that moment, according to investigators, that Orlando drew a 9mm Sig Sauer P365 semi-automatic pistol that he was carrying. He later told police that he raised his left arm to shield his face and fired while unable to clearly see his target. Within seconds, it was over. Unruh collapsed at the bottom of the staircase, her head resting to one side as blood flowed from her nose. Her black backpack was still slung over her right shoulder. In her right hand, she continued to grip the plastic bag containing the Nintendo Switch. Her handbag remained hanging from her left arm, details that reflected how completely prepared she had been to leave for work on what should have been an ordinary morning. Lying beside her, on the left side of her body, was the handgun that Orlando said he had dropped immediately after the shooting. Orlando then called 911. In the recording later released to the public, his voice was broken and panicked as he repeatedly told the dispatcher, "I shot her. I shot her." He went on to explain, "I came to return some of her belongings, and she got really angry that I was there. We argued, and she hit me. She hit me, and I tried to defend myself." When emergency responders arrived, Orlando was immediately taken into custody and handcuffed. Even then, however, he repeatedly pleaded with paramedics to save Unruh's life. Through tears, he was reported to have said, "I know she didn't mean to hurt me." Paramedics began emergency treatment at the scene as soon as they arrived, but their efforts could not undo what had happened. Ivy Unruh was pronounced dead at the scene, only minutes after walking out of her own flat. News of what had happened spread through PBS Kansas that very morning. Victor Hogstrom, the station's president, later recalled the moment he received the call. "When I heard the news, my first reaction was to slam both hands on my desk. What? I can't believe it." For the team that had worked alongside Unruh and trusted her as both a colleague and a friend, her sudden death left a void that could never truly be filled. Her family and close friends were also confronted with the devastating news within hours. In a tribute shared on a fundraising page created shortly afterwards, one of her friends described Unruh as strong and courageous, a woman who had served her country. The post went on to say that, to those who knew her, Unruh was far more than a former Marine. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose kindness had brought light into the lives of those around her. Only days after her death, Unruh's family revealed another deeply moving detail. She had become an organ donor, giving 6 other people the chance to live. "We received word from the organ donation team that Ivy saved the lives of 6 people," a family member shared. 6 parts of her will live on. 6 people are still alive and able to return to their families because of her. Unruh's story quickly reached far beyond the city of Wichita, attracting widespread media attention across Kansas and throughout the United States, not only because of the heartbreaking circumstances of her death, but also because of the seemingly ordinary Nintendo Switch that unexpectedly became one of the most talked about details of the case. For many people following the investigation, Unruh's death also reignited broader conversations about domestic violence, particularly the heightened danger victims often face during separation or divorce. Advocacy groups have long warned that this period can be one of the most dangerous stages in an abusive relationship, with the risk of serious violence frequently increasing rather than fading. The fundraising campaign established to support Unruh's family quickly received donations from across the country. Hundreds of people, many of whom had never met her, contributed after being moved by the story of a former Marine who had served her country with honor, only to lose her life at the hands of the man who had once been her husband. Immediately after the emergency call, officers from the Wichita Police Department arrived at Remington Apartments. Their first priority was to establish a secure perimeter around the base of the staircase, identified as the primary crime scene, ensuring that every piece of physical evidence remained undisturbed before the forensic examination began. Crime scene investigators then documented the area in accordance with standard investigative procedures. They recorded the position of the firearm, the location of Unruh's personal belongings, and secured footage from the apartment's doorbell camera, which had captured the critical moments leading up to the gunshot. Investigators also contacted the apartment complex's property manager to gather further information about Unruh, including previous conversations in which she had expressed concerns for her personal safety and her desire to keep her estranged husband away from her new home. Those statements later became an important part of the probable cause affidavit used by prosecutors to support the criminal charges. Everything Orlando said at the scene, including his 911 call and his statements to the first responding officers, was carefully documented and preserved as evidence. It was an unusual aspect of the case, with much of the initial account of the incident coming directly from the man who would later face criminal charges. The Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office became involved soon afterwards, working closely with Wichita police to prepare the case. Orlando was arrested at the scene and was subsequently charged with first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. Following his initial arrest, Orlando was remanded into custody at the Sedgwick County Jail, with bail set at $0.5 million. The exceptionally high amount reflected the seriousness with which prosecutors viewed the allegations and made it highly unlikely that he would be released while awaiting trial. For residents of Remington Apartments, the sight of police vehicles and crime scene tapes surrounding their building on what had begun as an ordinary weekday morning was something few could have imagined. Several neighbors later told local media that they had heard an unusual noise before seeing officers rapidly secure the area, unaware that a fatal shooting had taken place only meters from their own front doors. While investigators continued processing the crime scene, Ivy Unruh's body was transferred to the Sedgwick County Office of the Medical Examiner for a formal post-mortem examination. This is a mandatory step in every homicide involving a firearm, allowing forensic specialists to determine the precise cause of death, analyze the bullet's trajectory, and assess whether the medical evidence is consistent with the accounts already provided to investigators. The post-mortem examination confirmed that Unruh died from a gunshot wound to her upper body, a finding that was consistent with the physical evidence at the scene, where she had been found lying on her back with her head resting against the bottom step of the staircase. Firearms examiners then conducted a ballistic analysis, comparing the recovered projectile evidence with the Sig Sauer P365 pistol found beside the scene to confirm that it was the weapon used in the shooting. Ballistic testing, together with examinations for gunshot residue and other forensic evidence, played an important role in evaluating the accuracy of Orlando's account of what had happened. In addition to the charge of first-degree murder, prosecutors also filed a charge of aggravated kidnapping. According to the prosecution's legal theory, Orlando's decision to wait for Unruh at the bottom of the staircase, rather than leaving her belongings outside, as previously agreed, and his actions in preventing her from simply walking away were sufficient to support the allegation that she had been unlawfully restrained before the fatal shooting. All physical evidence recovered during the investigation, including the firearm, forensic samples collected at the scene, and the doorbell camera footage was submitted to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensic Science Laboratory for detailed examination as part of the prosecution's case. With Orlando's own statements, objective video evidence, and the forensic findings all reinforcing one another, prosecutors in Sedgwick County quickly assembled what was widely regarded as a strong body of evidence. That evidence would later become a significant factor in Orlando's decision to plead guilty rather than take the case before a jury. Although the forensic examination itself took only a matter of weeks, its significance extended far beyond the laboratory. It transformed what initially began as the suspect's own version of events into a case supported by independent scientific evidence that would prove difficult to challenge in court. Although Orlando admitted to firing the shot within minutes of the incident, investigators did not rely solely on his confession. One of their primary objectives was to determine whether his claim of self-defense could withstand scrutiny, specifically, whether his actions were legally proportionate to the level of threat he claimed he had faced. Detectives revisited the couple's history of conflict, including the incident from January 2025 that Orlando referenced during questioning, involving a replica Legend of Zelda sword. They compared his account with any previous reports, witness statements, or documented records to assess the credibility and consistency of his version of events. At the same time, investigators interviewed people who had indirect knowledge of the relationship. Staff from the apartment complex where Unruh lived were asked to describe the concerns she had previously expressed about her personal safety and her efforts to distance herself from Orlando. Friends and colleagues were also interviewed to provide insight into the condition of the relationship in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Prosecutors carefully reviewed the couple's divorce filings, including documents relating to the division of property and the allegations of domestic abuse that Unruh had formally presented to the court. These records provided important context for understanding both the deterioration of the marriage and the circumstances surrounding the fatal encounter. Digital investigators also examined text messages exchanged between the pair in the days before the shooting, including conversations about Orlando's request that they study together for a shared university class. Those communications helped investigators establish a clearer picture of the relationship immediately before the incident. As these various strands of evidence were brought together, prosecutors in Sedgwick County developed a comprehensive picture of the case. When considered alongside the physical and forensic evidence already collected, that broader body of information significantly weakened Orlando's argument that he had acted in lawful self-defense. It was also during this stage that Orlando's defense team began to appreciate the strength of the prosecution's case. The growing weight of the evidence would ultimately play an important role in the legal decisions that followed, shaping the course of the proceedings long before the matter could reach a jury. After the initial booking procedures were completed, Orlando was brought before the Sedgwick County District Court for his first arraignment. This mandatory stage of the criminal process is where a defendant is formally advised of the charges against them and is given the opportunity to enter a plea before the court. At that initial appearance, Orlando entered not guilty pleas, a routine procedural step in Kansas criminal cases that preserved all of his legal rights, while his defense lawyers continued reviewing the prosecution's evidence. A district judge was assigned to oversee the case, managing the subsequent hearings and ensuring that the proceedings followed the requirements of Kansas law. Orlando's defense team then began the discovery process, requesting full access to the prosecution's evidence, including the doorbell camera footage, forensic examination reports, and witness statements. This disclosure process is a fundamental safeguard within the American criminal justice system, allowing the defense to examine the evidence before any trial takes place. Over the following weeks, the case moved through a series of preliminary court hearings, during which prosecutors and defense lawyers addressed evidentiary issues, discussed witness testimony, and explored the possibility of resolving the case through a negotiated plea agreement, rather than proceeding to a jury trial. Throughout this period, Orlando remained in custody at the Sedgwick County Jail, unable to secure his release after bail had been set at $1.5 million. For Unruh's family, the legal process became another painful chapter in their grief. As they mourned her loss, they also found themselves following each court hearing closely, waiting to see how the justice system would respond to what had happened. Meanwhile, prosecutors from the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office continued strengthening their case, preparing for the possibility of presenting the evidence before a jury if no plea agreement could be reached. Every hearing, filing, and judicial ruling became part of the public court record, steadily building the legal framework that would ultimately determine the outcome of the case. After being taken to the Wichita Police Department, Orlando participated in a formal police interview, separate from the spontaneous statements he had made at the scene while visibly distressed. Before questioning began, detectives advised him of his Miranda rights, informing him of his right to remain silent and his right to have legal counsel present. This mandatory procedure ensured that any statements he chose to make could later be used as evidence in court. During the recorded interview, investigators focused on establishing a precise timeline of events, carefully comparing Orlando's formal account with what he had told the 911 operator and the first responding officers. Their objective was to determine whether his version of events remained consistent across each stage of the investigation. Detectives questioned him about several key issues, including why he chose to wait for Unruh instead of simply leaving her belongings outside the apartment, as they had agreed, why he had brought a firearm with him when returning her property, and exactly how the confrontation unfolded in the moments before the shot was fired. Notably, the central elements of Orlando's formal statement remained largely consistent with the account he had given immediately after the shooting. Legal observers later noted that this consistency presented a challenge for the defense, as it left little scope for introducing a substantially different explanation or developing new mitigating circumstances as the case progressed through the courts. The entire interview was audio recorded and preserved as part of the official case file. It became an important piece of evidence relied upon by prosecutors while preparing the final charges, and it was equally significant for Orlando's defense team as they assessed the strength of the prosecution's case and the likelihood of success if the matter proceeded to a jury trial. For experienced investigators, consistency across multiple statements, whether made in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event or during a structured police interview, is often regarded as an indicator that the account has remained stable over time. However, consistency alone does not determine whether a person's actions were legally justified, nor does it establish a valid legal defense under the law. Over the following months, prosecutors from the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office continued refining their case, preparing a prosecution strong enough to withstand scrutiny even if it ultimately proceeded before a jury. Three principal categories of evidence emerged as the foundation of the case: the objective footage captured by the apartment's doorbell camera, the forensic and ballistic findings, and Orlando's own consistent admissions throughout the investigation. One particularly significant witness was the apartment complex manager, who told investigators that Unruh had previously expressed concerns about her former husband's behavior and had specifically asked about the property's security features because she wanted to feel safe in her new home. Prosecutors viewed this testimony as important contextual evidence, helping to illustrate Unruh's state of mind in the months leading up to the shooting and undermining the defense's argument that Orlando had acted in lawful self-defense. The divorce filings, including Unruh's documented allegations of physical and emotional abuse, were also incorporated into the prosecution's case. Rather than portraying the shooting as an isolated confrontation, prosecutors argued that it represented the tragic culmination of a relationship marked by prolonged conflict and escalating tension. As the evidence continued to accumulate, Orlando's defense lawyers began negotiating with prosecutors over the possibility of a plea agreement. Such negotiations are common when the defense concludes that the likelihood of securing an acquittal before a jury is extremely limited, and that accepting responsibility may reduce certain legal risks associated with trial and sentencing. After multiple rounds of discussions, both sides moved closer to a final agreement. If accepted by the court, the plea would eliminate the need for a lengthy jury trial and mark the most significant turning point in the criminal proceedings. For Unruh's family, those negotiations brought deeply mixed emotions. They wanted Orlando to accept responsibility for what had happened, yet they also feared that resolving the case through a negotiated plea might deny them the full public examination of the evidence that a jury trial would have provided. On 1 July 2026, inside the Sedgwick County District Court, Joshua Orlando formally appeared before the judge and entered guilty pleas to both charges, first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. His decision removed the need for a full jury trial, a result that many following the case had anticipated, given the weight of the evidence assembled by investigators and prosecutors. By pleading guilty, Orlando formally accepted criminal responsibility for Ivy Unruh's death. While his admission could never undo the harm that had been done, it represented an important moment for Unruh's family, who had waited months to hear a clear and unequivocal acknowledgement of responsibility in open court. The Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office confirmed that, under Kansas sentencing laws applicable to the offenses Orlando admitted committing, he faced a minimum prison term of more than 38 years, before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The formal sentencing hearing was scheduled for 28th of August 2026, when the judge would determine Orlando's final sentence. For Unruh's family and for those who had closely followed the case since the day of the shooting, that hearing would mark the final stage of the criminal proceedings. The case also reignited broader discussions across Kansas about the dangers of domestic violence, particularly during separation and divorce. Victim advocacy organizations noted that the period when someone attempts to leave an abusive relationship is often one of the highest risk stages, despite the common assumption that the danger decreases once the relationship ends. For the community where Unruh had lived and worked, Orlando's guilty plea brought a measure of relief, even though it could never erase the loss. Former colleagues at PBS Kansas said that no sentence could restore what Unruh's family had lost, but they hoped that reaching a clear legal resolution rather than enduring years of litigation would at least allow those who loved her to begin moving forward with the difficult process of healing. Ivy Unruh once wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps, dedicating herself to serving her country. She later found the strength to leave a marriage she believed had become harmful, hoping to build a safer future for herself. Yet, on the very morning she walked out the front door, preparing to head to a job she genuinely loved, her life came to a sudden and tragic end. Even so, part of Ivy's legacy continues through 6 people whose lives were saved by her organ donations. In a story marked by heartbreak, that enduring gift of life remains one of the few sources of hope. For Unruh's family, however, no sentence imposed on Joshua Orlando, no matter how severe, can fill the void left by her death. No number of years behind bars can restore the ordinary mornings they lost, the conversations that will never be finished, or the future Ivy should have been allowed to live. Her story is also a sobering reminder that the most dangerous stage of an abusive relationship is often not when it begins, but when someone tries to leave. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, seek help from your local domestic violence support services or law enforcement before the situation escalates. Thank you for staying with us through Ivy Unruh's story. If this case has given you something to reflect on, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss future true crime documentaries. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.